Welcome back to Crosstabs. I'm your host, Farrah Bostic. This is an off week for the show. We're redoing a few things about how we handle production and how we map out our stories. And also it is now a little bit more of a we as opposed to mainly me and Allison, the editor. It is also Credence, who handles all of our social media. And we're bringing in some other people to help me develop these stories and prepare for interviews and bring you information about how we know each other, how we know the country, and how we got here. One of the things that I think has been a struggle for me in explaining why anybody who doesn't work in polling or market research might want to listen to this podcast is simply this. And that is that it feels pretty technical. It feels pretty niche and pretty nerdy to be talking to researchers at Pew or pollsters for various campaigns or political scientists at various academic institutions about their areas of interest, recent research, key findings, how they conducted their research. But I think the point of this show really is that we have a lot of things going on in our democracy that feel like contradictions, feel like they just don't make sense, and maybe they never did, or maybe just they've been upended in some kind of, significant, catastrophic even way. And all of those things are probably true, but I think I have conversations with people frequently who are just baffled by how polls can show a fair amount of unpopularity around specific policy proposals of this new administration, while still showing a generally favorable opinion of the new president. I see people confused about why someone would vote for AOC and also for Trump, why someone would go vote for, say, Kari Lake and also vote to protect abortion rights in the state of Arizona. These are good questions, and they are answerable questions. And if you want to understand those contradictions, this, I hope, is a show to help you understand them. One of the things that I think is tricky often is that I'm not a political science professor. I have a political science degree. I am not a law professor. I have a law degree. I am not a journalist. I have a journalism degree. I have too many degrees. But the other thing is I'm not a pollster, but I am. I do opinion research. I conduct focus groups. I do ethnography. I conduct surveys. I do all sorts of message testing and value proposition testing and segmentation studies and all of this stuff. And so there is an interesting thing about being a knowledgeable outsider, and that is that I think it puts you in a position of being able to look at the way things are, the way things are done, and to kind of say, why? Why do we do it that way? Has nothing evolved about our understanding of how people engage with information, the economy, politics, each other? Or are we doing this just because, we have benchmarks for it? And so because we've been asking this question this way for a really long time, and we think it has some correlative power in explaining other behaviors or other outcomes in our system, then we should carry on asking this question this way. I think that a lot of what happens in the public sphere around the discussion of polling and public opinion and public information is really aimed around a desire to predict outcomes. And I can't tell you how uninterested I am in prediction. I am far more interested in understanding the state of things, understanding how things are changing in the midst of that change, and trying to be able to help my clients and help you, the audience, make sense of that change and respond to it with good decision-making skills. And so in many respects, that's what I'm hoping this show will do. It will demystify polling and public data and political science and why campaigns work the way they do, why parties work the way they do, how we got to this place where people seem to be able to hold all of these competing political views in their head at the same time. So in order to do that, we're going to start experimenting with some new formats and some new ways of doing things. So think of this as kind of a housekeeping episode after that 5-minute preamble. The thing that we have primarily been doing since I started the show is interviews, and we will continue to do that. We have some conversations coming up with people you've heard from previously. If you've been a long-time listener to the show, Michael Podorzer will be coming back on to talk about collective power. We will have Rachel Bidikofer back on to talk about what Democrats should do when they're not actively running for office in a midterm election. There are a couple of special elections happening this year, but this is not an election year. So what do Democrats do in a not election year in order to fulfill any kind of democratic role? We're also going to start looking at some more specific case studies of places where, in recent memory, in the last 12, 15 years, Democrats had power and lost it. Or vice versa, Republicans had power and lost it, and try to understand what the systems were that brought that change into being. It's never one thing, by the way. It's never just like some particularly charismatic candidate. That charismatic candidate has to enter into an opportunity zone, let's put it that way. And that requires a whole lot of other things going right and going wrong, depending on which side of the line you stand on. And so I have some stories that I'm putting together. Some of them are local to where I live. I'm hoping to develop some in other parts of the country as well, that just sort of explain how a place that used to be very blue is now not, and used to be very red is now not, because I think there is a lot that's revealed about how politics works, about how demographic change influences politics, about how economic change influences politics, and about how propaganda influences politics. So all of those things are going to be on the docket in sort of very localized, specific stories, which we will probably do in 2 or 3 parts, because there's always a lot to unpack in any of those places. That's one type of story we're going to start doing. The other type of story that we're going to start doing is a kind of how did we get here in terms of the tools we have available for understanding each other, the economy, each other as citizens, each other as voters, each other as consumers, because it's actually a really interesting kind of story. If you've ever listened to the show Behind the Bastards, think of these episodes as being a little bit like that, but for public opinion research. How did we get to a place where we use surveys to understand each other as voters, as consumers, and so on? How did we get to a place where we use focus groups or ethnography or other kind of social science methods for understanding each other? Why do they get used in the particular way they get used? Why do they get designed in the particular way they get designed in the political realm versus the commercial realm? All of that comes down to some very interesting characters from history who had some very interesting motivations. I will give you a tiny teaser/spoiler about this, which is that almost all social science is either moving towards eugenics or trying to explain fascism. There's not a lot else going on in these fields. I mean, that's a gross overgeneralization, but it's not wrong. So we're going to look at those kinds of things. How did we get here? Kind of a history of these people. And you got a little bit of a sense of that from an episode I did with W. Joseph Campbell, who wrote Lost in a Gallop. We may have him back on because he's written a couple of other terrific books. And this is an area of particular interest that I've had for a long time, of just like, who invented this stuff? How did it come about? And why do we have it in the places that we have it? Why does the media, the military, politics, why are these the places where a lot of these methods ultimately kind of get birthed and nurtured and fed in their early days, and then sort of bleed out into the broader business and political worlds? So that will be our kind of Behind the Bastards episodes. Shout out to Cool Zone Media for that. So that's another bucket of things. Then there is a third bucket of stories that ideas really, that I want to explore with guests and with you, the audience, which is about this funny divide that happened sometime in the 1980s, I think, really, in which Madison Avenue, traditional advertising agencies, had been the go-to source for campaign messaging, for presidential campaigns in particular, for a very long time, pretty much since, the invention of television, and probably before then. And sometime in the 1980s, early 1990s, that shifted. We weren't going to, if I was a Republican candidate for president, I wasn't going to J. Walter Thompson anymore in order to get my advertising campaign done. I was going to a set of consultants on K Street in Washington, D.C. And that shift from Madison Avenue to K Street is something I've been kind of obsessed with since like the late 1990s, when it was kind of in the midst of happening and had the whole key had fully turned over in the lock. There are a lot of things that the advertising industry has figured out that people who never worked in the advertising agency business don't know about, or don't seem to know about, or seem to think doesn't apply to them if they are trying to sell candidates instead of trying to sell gum or cigarettes or whatever advertising is trying to sell. The practices and the kind of marketing science that has been developed over decades now is there for the taking for people who work in politics if they cared to learn about it. And so I want to explore that intersection that has kind of now become a bypass. They don't really intersect any longer. And so there are a lot of themes about that I want to look at. In the context of politics, what is a brand? What is a product? What is a message? How should you be developing and measuring those things? What are the tools that are not being used, and why are they not being used? How did we get from the I Like Ike campaign to whatever the heck it is we're doing now? The other things that I'm interested in are more general. I think it would be nice to have some more journalists on the show, because I think there is a real kind of opportunity to explore the way that the press, the politicians, the parties, and the voters interact, and to understand better the system within which they interact. And so this is related to the episode that went out a couple weeks ago now, by the time you're hearing this, with Emily Ross and Alistair Kroll, who wrote this amazing book about marketing strategy called Just Evil Enough. It's really important that all of these players, from voters to politicians to parties to journalists, understand the system better. Because I think there is a lot of system blindness that is happening here. And people cannot see their role or their power within that system. And when you can't see your role or the power that role holds, you can't really do anything with it. And so I think there is a lot of, frankly, learned helplessness here, because people are failing to see the system and then are failing to understand ways that they might be able to get some kind of unfair advantage within that system, get some kind of purchase within that system to make it serve them better. And I think that is, in large part, that learned helplessness is how we got to this place. And then there is a final bucket, which is something that I need more time to develop, because I previously was not your dad who's super into World War II documentaries, but I'm rapidly becoming that person, in part because I think we have a lot of people, some of them have been guests on this show, who are convinced that we are repeating 1932, 1933 in Germany. I know some people who think it's already 1938. I'm not sure it's 1938. You never know. But actually, I don't think it's a great analogy. And there are parts of it that work really well and parts of it that don't work very well at all. And I think that people get a little locked up in surface level comparisons. Things like there were 50 states in the Weimar Republic and there are 50 states in the United States. Those states were absolutely not the same as these states. The Weimar Constitution was only like 14 years old when it was basically upended by Hitler. Our Constitution has been around a little bit longer than that. This is a much bigger country than Germany is. The idea of you stage a coup in Prussia, a stronghold of democratic values, and that's it. That's the ball game. You can invoke Article 48 and dissolve the Constitution and take over as a dictator chancellor. We don't have an Article 48. There is not a single stronghold of democratic values. It is evenly distributed, actually, throughout most of the country. There are some states that are governed by people who have democratic values and some states that are not. But there are people who believe in democracy in all 50 states. And then the other thing I would just say, and this is probably not any great, comfort to those who might be listening right now, but this is a country that is armed to the teeth. And I think there is a real underestimation of the lengths pro-democracy forces might go to in order to defend democracy. And so I think if we're assuming that all of the power and frankly, all the potential for violence exists on one side and not the other, then I think that is one of the biggest places where the analogy starts to break down. It's a big country armed to the teeth with democratic values distributed all across it and with extremely robust state governments. And this is not analogous to the Weimar Republic. So I want to unpack a little bit more the things that make us different from that period of time, because I sense that a lot of people think that we're just repeating history. But here's one of the things about history repeating. Obviously, you've probably heard this phrase before, but history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. And that is because we have seen it before, so we never really do it the same way twice, not perfectly. And we know a lot about Hitler and a lot about Mussolini and a lot about Pinochet and a variety of other strongmen. We know a lot about the thinkers that are informing this administration and what they think a playbook is. We don't have to put our heads in the sand and pretend that they haven't written it down. One of my maxims of the first Trump administration is that there is always a memo. And there is always a memo. There is always a blog post, a memo, a tweet thread, a podcast appearance in which the people who would like to undo the democracy as we know it show their whole asses. And we need to look at those things and actually understand them. But we also need to stop thinking about the pattern of the 1930s in the same way that some people think about Alan Lichtman's keys for predicting the outcome of a presidential election. Things aren't that simple. And so I think we may do a few episodes where we try to draw some contrasts between what this administration is trying to do and what history has shown us, because there are some real opportunities in understanding those differences. There are some real opportunities in understanding what people tried in real time in those countries and in those times to stop the tide of an autocratic takeover, and therefore what it is that is left to be tried and what things, should be tried again, but this time with more people, more money, more force. And I don't necessarily mean violent force. I just mean more energy and effort. And so these are also things that I'm very curious about and want to dive in a little bit more on. And we may have some folks who are experts in authoritarianism, experts in totalitarianism, and experts in these types of regimes come on to try to talk about what's different and what's not. And then the final category of things that I'm interested in. And that is, I think we have had a period of politics that has been incredibly defined by nostalgia. And this administration is also defined by a kind of nostalgia. This is part of why I had Grafton Tanner on as the first episode of this season in 2025. Because I think we have to understand the way that nostalgia works on our politics, on our culture, on our own minds, in order to think about what a future actually is. We are living in a time that makes it really hard to reckon with the present. And so I think it's easier to think back to what has been. That feels more stable somehow. I think it's also why you have this anti-DEI movement, because it suggests that the past is contested, that America was not always morally up and to the right, that it was, in fact, compromised deeply from the founding. And I think that the Biden campaign tapped into a form of nostalgia as well by using the phrase build back better, building back to something that previously existed, but doing it, having shored up the foundations a bit. It's more preservationist and conservationist than it is, projecting into a future that would be better. And so I am extremely interested in other ideas of democracy and what a more modernized democracy might look like. Tim Snyder has a book called On Freedom that I have just started to crack, and there are some very interesting ideas in there. He is not the first to write about this. There's also a book, and I apologize to the author, I cannot remember your name, but the book is called something like Where Rights Went Wrong. We have had a regime of thinking about freedom as largely freedom from various kinds of government interference or oppression in particular. We have not had a more kind of positivist conception of freedom that is a freedom to. If you think of a democracy instead of being as a deliberative body, but as one that is built to kind of help create the conditions under which the people who live within it can flourish, then that might lead you to a variety of different, not just policy positions, but different modes of governing and different modes of selecting candidates, different modes of party formation or even having parties. There's a lot to be imagined. And I would like to engage some conversations that are kind of a democratic futurism conversation, because I think it's very hard to simply stand athwart yelling stop at something we don't like. It's hard work. It's certainly the erstwhile motto of the National Review, but it is also not really where we need to focus our desires. Simply stopping the bad guys from being bad will not be enough. There has to be something better on the other side. And I'd like to explore some of those ideas with people. There is also a kind of abundance and prosperity movement. There is certainly an interesting challenge to the idea of rights regimes. There's an interesting challenge to the idea of what freedom is for. And I think all of those conversations are worth having. And I think they're worth having for a variety of reasons. If we can start to formulate in our heads what those values and structures and procedures might be and interactions might be, we could actually start to study people's desire for it. And we could also start to evangelize it if we can come up with something that sounds good. Pretty lofty goals for a podcast that struggles to come out once a week. But here's where I'm going to put in my kind of final 2 cents on this. I hope that you're up for that journey. I hope that you are willing to help out a little bit. And here are the 3 ways you can help out. One, of course, is if you have not already subscribed to the show, please do so in your favorite podcast app. If you like the show, please give us a rating. And if you have an extra 30 seconds, please write a review. It really does help people come across the show in places like Apple Podcasts. So that's number 1. A big bucket of tasks within number 1. Number 2 is we have a Substack. It is at crosstabspod.substack.com. I'd really love it if you would subscribe to that as well. We're going to start running some smaller experiments inside of that channel. There will be a bit more frequent posting there. In addition to updates about the episodes, there will just be other writing and essays there. We may also start to do some video shorts or some podcast shorts that we distribute through the Substack. So please go and subscribe there. And if you already have a Substack of your own, consider recommending ours. It is another great way for people to find our newsletter. And then the third thing is, please do get in touch with me if you have ideas for guests or topics or questions you would like answered about polling or public data or political science or democracy or the history of these methods. All of those things are, or even just about the methods themselves. If you would really like an explanation of regression analysis, we can do it. But please get in touch with me at farrah@crosstabspodcast.com and let me know what you think. And that's it. I will see you next week. Crosstabs is hosted by me, Farrah Bostic, production by The Difference Engine, and edited now by Allison Preisinger of AMP Studio. Music from Audio Jungle by S Audio. Find us at crosstabspodcast.com, where you can subscribe to our weekly Substack, also available at crosstabspod.substack.com. Tell your friends about the show, subscribe on your favorite podcast service, and give the show a rating or review. I would love to hear from you, and it will help other people find the show. Email me if you have any questions, ideas for episode topics, suggestions for future guests, or want to talk about ways we can work together at farrah@crosstabspodcast.com. See you next time.